Good evening, my friends. I hope this message reaches you in a peaceful moment, maybe with a warm drink in your hand and a quiet room around you. Tonight, we are stepping into a story that shattered the foundations of global power, and I want to thank you for being here, for caring about the truth in a time when truth is treated like contraband. Because what unfolded in West Africa this year didn't just reshape a region, it cracked open the entire architecture of how the modern world operates. And whether you live in California, Ohio, or a quiet town in New England, the tremors have already reached your doorstep, rippling through energy markets, security councils, and the hidden conversations happening in rooms you'll never enter. If uranium is the lifeblood of industrial nations, then the heart of West Africa just changed owners. 40 trucks rolled out of the Nigerian desert at dusk, slow, deliberate, heavily guarded, and for the first time in half a century, not 1 ounce of that uranium answered to France. Europe panicked. Energy officials scrambled through contingency plans they thought they'd never need. Headlines whispered about instability, but almost no one asked the real question, the one that unlocks everything. Why now? And that's where this story turns from news into revelation. Because this moment in Niger didn't materialize from thin air. It followed a blueprint, a quiet revolution ignited not in Niamey but in Ouagadougou under the leadership of a young captain named Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso. His defiance rewrote the psychology of an entire region. He proved that a small nation could look a superpower in the eye and simply say no more. And once that idea escaped the borders of Burkina Faso, it did what powerful ideas always do. It spread like wildfire through dry grass, unstoppable and transformative. The story begins not in a palace or parliament, but on a stretch of desert so vast and silent that even the wind seems hesitant to disturb its secrets. There sits Arlit, a town built on uranium, yet trapped in perpetual darkness. This place was once a promise. Now, it's a scar on the landscape. Families slept beside radioactive waste, while the power their labor produced illuminated the cities of France, kept European homes warm, and powered industries an ocean away. For 50 years, uranium left Niger quietly, cheaply, without ceremony or acknowledgement. The world pretended this arrangement was normal, natural even. The people living next to the mines knew better. They knew the truth written in their contaminated water, their unreliable electricity, their children's futures traded for someone else's comfort. And then, in a single stroke that echoed across continents, Niger did something no analyst predicted. The junta nationalized its uranium. To most outsiders scrolling through their news feeds, that sounded like a bureaucratic adjustment, another headline to scroll past. But for the people of Niger, it was a declaration written in the language of dignity. This belongs to us now. The French company Orano, the absolute cornerstone of Europe's nuclear comfort for generations, was stripped of its license to operate. Paris expected negotiations, hesitation, maybe even fear and capitulation. Instead, Niger doubled down with a confidence that stunned diplomatic circles. Within weeks, intelligence networks across Europe picked up whispers that chilled conference rooms, whispers of a movement taking physical form. 40 trucks loaded with uranium concentrate were preparing to travel not north toward the old French colonial routes, but south toward Togo, toward the Gulf of Guinea, toward a completely new map that no colonial-era imagination had ever dared to draw. The convoy departed at dusk when the desert heat finally relented. No corporate logos adorned the trucks, no diplomatic escorts smoothed the path. Just Nigerian soldiers and Russian Africa Corps contractors flanking the cargo like shadows carved from steel and resolve. The engines groaned under their precious load. The sand lifted in golden clouds. And somewhere in Paris, in Brussels, in Washington, the old order trembled on foundations it thought were concrete. This wasn't commerce as usual. This was a message written on wheels, traveling at 30 miles per hour toward a future the West never authorized. For decades, France treated Niger's uranium supply as guaranteed, as reliable as sunrise, as predictable as gravity. It powered nearly 20% of French nuclear energy, fed reactors across the continent, kept electricity bills stable, and underwrote Europe's claim to energy independence. And it was all secured by a single belief, a conviction so deeply embedded it was never questioned. Niger would never defy Paris. But when those trucks rolled south, escorted by forces that didn't answer to French command, that belief died. Inside European ministries, alarms started ringing in rooms designed to handle crises. Energy security analysts scrambled to their computers, calculating the magnitude of the loss. Could Kazakhstan fill the gap? Could Canada ramp up production fast enough? Could the global market absorb this shock without catastrophic price spikes? The answers were all variations of the same uncomfortable truth. No, not quickly, and not without pain. Uranium prices spiked. Contracts tightened across the board. Suddenly, Europe realized something it had successfully ignored for too long, that sovereignty in Africa carries a bill, and Europe had not budgeted for the price. Yet the deeper you look beyond the spreadsheets and the panic, the clearer a pattern becomes. This wasn't spontaneous combustion. Niger had been humiliated when Nigeria cut power supplies after the 2023 coup, plunging cities into blackout while the country simultaneously exported uranium to light European homes thousands of miles away. That blackout didn't just inconvenience people. It transformed frustration into fury. It taught the leaders in Niamey a lesson that no diplomatic cable could convey. A nation cannot borrow its future from someone else's electrical grid. So when Niger seized control of the uranium, it wasn't merely reclaiming a resource. It was reclaiming the entire story of who they were allowed to be in the global order. Local anger had been simmering for decades, building pressure like water behind a weakening dam. Pollution in Arlit, water contamination that doctors whispered about but couldn't fix, abandoned waste pits. A pervasive sense that foreign companies extracted wealth while leaving sickness behind like discarded packaging. Investigations over the years had pointed to discrepancies, underreported production numbers, conflicting reserve estimates, questionable environmental practices that would never be tolerated in Europe. But complaints bounced harmlessly off a diplomatic wall. France protected Urano, and Urano protected France's energy comfort. It was a perfect closed loop until it wasn't. What changed in 2023 wasn't merely political leadership or military power. It was psychological temperature. The new rulers didn't fear losing Western aid because they'd watched that aid fail to transform their country for generations. They saw foreign pressure not as punishment, but as proof that sovereignty still mattered enough to fight for. And in that moment of clarity, Niger found its voice. They reviewed old contracts with fresh eyes, found gaps wide enough to drive a convoy of 40 trucks through, and made a decision that echoed from Niamey all the way to the Élysée Palace. The uranium would be sold on the open market. Highest bidder wins. No more special deals negotiated in backrooms. No more silent discounts that papered over colonial relationships. No more mathematics where Niger always came out on the losing end of the equation. Global buyers circled immediately like sharks sensing blood in the water. Russia, Turkey, Iran, even nations that had never looked at African uranium before suddenly recognized its strategic value. For the first time in its history, Niger could set the price instead of accepting the price dictated to them. To France, this was more than an economic blow. It was a crack in the armor of influence, a fissure in the entire system. For 50 years, Paris had maintained its role in West Africa by controlling the arteries of extraction, the flow of resources from African soil to European industry. When Niger broke that chain, it sent a signal across the entire Sahel that the old master's grip was weaker than anyone believed, weaker than even the master believed. But here's the twist the world still hasn't fully understood, the part that keeps me awake, turning over the implications. Niger didn't leap alone into this void. It leaped because someone had already shown them what defiance looks like when it doesn't collapse under its own weight. Someone had already removed French troops, expelled Western contractors, survived the sanctions, and emerged stronger. Someone had demonstrated with actions, not words, that sovereignty isn't a slogan you chant at rallies, it's a weapon you wield in negotiating rooms. That someone was Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, and the shockwave he created was just beginning to propagate across the region. Before we continue, I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments, because this story touches every corner of the globe. The turning point didn't appear in a boardroom in Brussels or a ministry office in Paris. It appeared in the eyes of a young captain in Burkina Faso who refused to live inside a script written by strangers for their benefit. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the world stage, analysts dismissed him as a temporary figure, a transitional officer who would fade from relevance like so many before him, replaced by someone more pliable, more reasonable, more willing to play the game. But they were catastrophically wrong. They underestimated something they couldn't measure on a spreadsheet or quantify in an intelligence briefing. Conviction backed by popular support. Traoré didn't simply remove the French military presence from Burkina Faso. He shattered the foundational idea that France was irreplaceable in African security. He replaced Western advisors with local commanders who knew the terrain and the people. He rejected debt diplomacy that came with strings attached to every dollar. He spoke openly, almost recklessly by diplomatic standards, about sovereignty, about dignity, about the right of African nations to control their own destiny. And each time the international community predicted his imminent downfall, he remained standing, growing stronger, in fact. That endurance did something profound to the psychology of the Sahel. It proved that resistance didn't have to collapse under external pressure or internal chaos. When Niger nationalized its uranium months later, it was more than policy implementation. It was a mirror reflecting Traoré's defiance back across borders. The generals in Niamey had watched closely and seen a model that actually worked in practice. A government that expelled French troops didn't dissolve into anarchy. It survived sanctions without capitulating. It strengthened its military capabilities. And most importantly, it gained popular support instead of losing it. Burkina Faso had already absorbed all the political blowback that Niger feared. Traoré had taken the hit and grown stronger from the impact. In Ouagadougou, crowds marched through streets, carrying his portrait like a banner of hope. In Niamey, those images were studied with intense interest. A leader backed by his people becomes extraordinarily difficult to remove. A leader backed by his people and supported by a rising geopolitical partner becomes nearly untouchable. That's where Russia enters the picture with calculated precision. Moscow watched Traoré's rise with strategic interest, not primarily because of Burkina Faso's gold deposits or agricultural land, but because he created something far more valuable, a viable alternative to French security doctrine. He opened the door to Africa Corps cooperation and demonstrated that Russian partnerships could thrive exactly where Western frameworks had collapsed into irrelevance. For Russia, Traoré became proof of concept. For Niger, he became a blueprint for political survival. So when the uranium nationalization erupted into international headlines, Russia responded not with the bombastic propaganda Western officials expected, but with something far more dangerous and effective: logistics. The same style of military training, security cooperation, and corridor building that Traoré had accepted began flowing quietly into Niger. The convoy of 40 uranium trucks, escorted by Nigerian soldiers and Russian contractors working in coordinated precision, wasn't just a commercial shipment. It was a signature, a stamp of approval on a new model. It echoed the pattern already visible in Burkina Faso and expanding across the map. When news reached Paris, alarms went off in every relevant ministry. Officials whispered urgently about losing the last anchor point in the Sahel. The French Parliament held emergency sessions behind closed doors. Energy analysts warned of a strategic rupture that could reshape European security for decades. But the most devastating realization arrived slowly, sinking in like cold water. France was no longer dealing with one rebellious state that could be isolated and pressured. It was dealing with a chain reaction triggered by Traoré's example and amplified by Russia's patient presence. In Brussels, European Union officials scrambled desperately for uranium alternatives, only to learn that securing reliable supply in a tightening global market was like trying to buy water during a catastrophic drought. Everyone needs it, few have excess, and the price only moves in one direction. Their panic wasn't really about Niger alone. It was about the horrifying question of what happens if more African states begin demanding real market prices for their minerals, if they coordinate their sovereignty instead of competing for Western approval. If Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger could align their policies and leverage their collective resources, Europe's entire energy map would fracture along lines no one had planned for. In Washington, the shock ran even deeper through the corridors of the Pentagon and State Department. The United States had invested heavily in Niger as its primary counterterrorism hub in West Africa. Drone bases, intelligence networks, regional training partnerships. This was supposed to be the American foothold, the anchor point for projecting influence across the Sahel. Suddenly, that foothold was slipping through their fingers like sand. Agreements were being renegotiated from positions of unexpected strength. Access to critical facilities was shrinking month by month. The alliance Washington had counted on as permanent was drifting toward a completely new center of gravity. And that center wasn't Moscow or Niamey. The real center, the ideological and emotional core, was Ouagadougou and the young captain who had proven that the impossible was merely difficult. Here's what makes this story genuinely unsettling for Western strategists lying awake at 3 in the morning. Ibrahim Traoré was not predicted by any model. He wasn't groomed through Western-funded leadership programs. He didn't rise through channels that diplomats understood and could influence. He emerged from the cracks of a broken security landscape and built legitimacy from the ground up through actions that resonated with ordinary people. That authenticity, that organic connection to popular frustration, made him fundamentally unpredictable and therefore dangerous to established powers that rely on predictability. If this still sounds like a distant regional dispute that won't affect your life, that's only because that's the comfortable version the world prefers to believe. But the truth cuts sharper. A young captain from Burkina Faso forced Europe, America, and Russia to completely recalibrate their strategies in real time. He made the world's largest powers rewrite their playbooks for an entire region, and the convoy of uranium trucks rolling south through the night, that was just the opening move. The most volatile shift is still ahead, and it's not about who controls the uranium. It's about who controls the roads, the corridors, the arteries of movement that will decide the fate of nations for the next 50 years. That battle is only beginning. And if you want to understand where the world is actually heading, you need to keep watching this space, because the Sahel isn't the margin of global power anymore. It's becoming the hinge on which everything turns. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next chapter of this story will shock you even more than what you've heard tonight.